The music stopped the moment Duke Alastair Whitmore raised his hand. 300 guests stood frozen under the golden light of Ashcombe Hall, their glasses of champagne halfway to their lips, their smiles caught between confusion and shock. The orchestra, sensing something was wrong, let their bows fall silent against the strings. Every eye in the room turned toward the man standing at the top of the marble staircase, dressed in a deep blue coat with silver buttons that caught the candlelight like small flames. Beside him stood a woman in a gown of rich emerald silk. Her dark hair was pinned with pearls, and her lips were curved into a smile that seemed too confident for a guest, too proud for a stranger. Her name was Seraphina Cole, and she had been the subject of quiet whispers among the aristocracy for almost a year. Tonight, those whispers were about to become a roar. "Friends," Alastair said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, the way a man's voice does when he has never once doubted that a room belongs to him. "I have gathered you all here tonight not only to celebrate the season, but to share news that is close to my heart." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Fans stopped fluttering. Conversations died mid-sentence. Alastair reached for Seraphina's hand and lifted it gently, as though presenting a prize he had won at a country fair. "I wish to announce," he continued, "that Lady Seraphina Cole will soon become the next Duchess of Ashcombe." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room broke into a storm of hushed voices, some gasping, some laughing in disbelief, some simply staring at the man who had just humiliated his own wife in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most to him. Because Alastair was already married. His wife, Duchess Eleanor Whitmore, stood near the far end of the ballroom, close to the tall windows that overlooked the moonlit gardens. She did not gasp, she did not cry out, she did not even blink. She simply smiled. It was not the smile of a woman caught off guard. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. Eleanor had known about Seraphina for months. She had known about the secret meetings in the East Wing library, the letters hidden beneath loose floorboards, the perfume that lingered on her husband's coat when he returned late from what he called business in the city. She had known, and she had said nothing, because saying something before the right moment would have accomplished nothing at all. Tonight was the right moment. She glanced toward her old friend, Charlotte Bramwell, who stood beside her holding a small leather folder against her chest as though it were a shield. Charlotte's eyes were wide with worry, but Eleanor only gave her the faintest nod. "Not yet," that nod said. "Let him finish." Alastair, drunk on the attention of the room and the warmth of Seraphina's hand in his, did not notice his wife at all. He was too busy enjoying the shocked faces of the lords and ladies who had once looked down on him for his family's fading fortune. Tonight, he believed, he was rewriting his own story. He believed he was the master of Ashcombe Hall, the man who could stand beneath its painted ceilings and declare whatever he wished, because the house had belonged to his family for 4 generations. What he did not know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that Ashcombe Hall no longer belonged to him at all. 2 years earlier, buried under gambling debts he refused to speak of and drowning in a sea of unpaid accounts, Alastair had signed a stack of papers late one night after too much wine. He remembered the signing only vaguely, remembered his solicitor mentioning something about protecting the estate and securing the family name. He had waved a hand and scrawled his signature without reading a single line, eager to return to his card game in the drawing room. He never asked what those papers said. Eleanor had read every word. The documents had transferred ownership of Ashcombe Hall, along with several smaller properties and a considerable portion of the family's remaining wealth, directly into her name. It was, on paper, a protective measure against his creditors. In truth, it was the only way Eleanor had found to save something of the life she had built, after years of being treated as an afterthought in her own marriage. She had not done it out of spite, not at first. She had done it out of necessity, the same quiet necessity that had taught her how to manage a household on a shrinking budget, how to smile at dinner parties while creditors sent letters demanding payment, how to hold a family together while her husband chased pleasure in every corner of the city. But necessity has a way of becoming power if a woman is patient enough to wait. And Eleanor Whitmore was patient. Across the ballroom, Alastair lifted his glass, still holding Seraphina's hand. "To new beginnings," he declared, his voice rich with pride. "To the future Duchess of Ashcombe Hall." A few guests raised their glasses out of habit, more from confusion than agreement. Others turned to look at Eleanor, waiting to see how the humiliated wife would react. Would she weep? Would she flee the room in shame? Would she stand silently and accept the destruction of her marriage in front of everyone she had ever known? Eleanor set down her own glass. Then she began to walk. Her steps were unhurried, her back straight, her chin lifted in the manner of a woman who had nothing left to fear. The crowd parted for her without being asked, sensing that something important was about to happen, something far more interesting than a duke's foolish announcement. Seraphina noticed her first. Her smile faltered just slightly as Eleanor approached the staircase. She had heard about the Duchess, of course. Alastair had described her as cold, distant, a woman more interested in ledgers than love. Seraphina had pictured someone small and forgettable. She had not pictured this, a woman who moved through a crowded room as though she owned every stone of it. Because she did. Alastair finally noticed his wife when she was only a few steps away. His confident smile flickered, just for a moment, replaced by something closer to irritation. He had expected Eleanor to remain quiet, as she always did. He had expected her to disappear into some other room, to save her tears for later, to spare him the embarrassment of a scene in front of his guests. He had never once considered that she might do the opposite. "Eleanor," he said, his voice suddenly less certain, "this is not the time." "On the contrary," Eleanor replied, her voice calm and clear enough for those nearby to hear every word. "I think this is exactly the time." The room, which had been buzzing with whispered gossip, fell silent again. Every guest strained to listen, sensing that the real announcement of the evening had not yet been made. Eleanor turned to face the crowd, standing beside her husband and his mistress as though she had been invited to join them. "My husband has just told you all that Lady Seraphina Cole will become the next Duchess of Ashcombe," she said. "I would like to correct one small detail in his announcement." Alastair's jaw tightened. "Eleanor, do not." "There is no Duchess of Ashcombe to replace," Eleanor continued, ignoring him completely. "Because in a few months there will be no Duke of Ashcombe living in this house at all." A wave of gasps swept through the ballroom. Fans fluttered rapidly now, and whispers turned into open murmurs. Seraphina's fingers slipped from Alastair's hand, her confidence cracking like thin ice. "What are you talking about?" Alastair demanded, his voice rising, no longer smooth and confident but sharp with confusion. Eleanor allowed herself a small, quiet smile. "You are standing in my hall, Alastair," she said. "You have been for quite some time. You simply never bothered to read the papers you signed." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. Guests turned to one another, whispering questions no one could yet answer. Alastair stared at his wife as though seeing her for the first time, searching her calm expression for some sign that she was bluffing, some crack in her composure that would tell him this was only a moment of wounded pride speaking. He found none. Charlotte stepped forward quietly and placed the leather folder in Eleanor's hands. Eleanor opened it just enough to reveal the edge of a document, the wax seal still intact, the ink of her husband's own signature visible beneath the candlelight. "I did not come here tonight to fight with you in front of our friends," Eleanor said, her voice steady, almost gentle. "I came because you needed to understand once and for all exactly whose house you are standing in when you make your grand declarations." Alastair opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his life, the room was not his to command. The silence that filled Ashcombe Hall did not belong to him, it belonged to his wife. And as the guests watched, murmuring and staring, uncertain whether they were witnessing a scandal or the birth of something else entirely, Eleanor closed the folder gently and looked at her husband with an expression that was neither cruel nor forgiving. It was simply certain. "Enjoy the rest of the evening," she said softly. "It may be the last one you spend under this roof." Then she turned, walked back through the parting crowd, and left her husband standing beside his mistress in the very hall that no longer belonged to him at all. 3 years before that night in the ballroom, Eleanor Whitmore had learned the exact sound of a door closing on her marriage. It was not a loud sound. It was quiet, almost polite, the way most endings are when they happen behind closed doors instead of in front of a crowd. She had been sitting in the drawing room of Ashcombe Hall, a stack of unpaid bills spread across the table in front of her, when she heard her husband's carriage return from the city far later than he had promised. She remembered rising from her chair, smoothing her skirts, preparing to greet him the way a wife was expected to greet a husband who had been away for 2 days on unexplained business. She remembered the smell of unfamiliar perfume on his coat when he finally stepped through the door, sweet and floral, nothing like the soap she used, nothing like anything that belonged to their home. She had said nothing that night. She had only taken his coat, hung it carefully, and asked if he wanted supper warmed. That had always been Eleanor's way. Not because she lacked feeling, but because she understood, long before anyone else in her family did, that anger spoken too soon was wasted anger. It burned bright and then it burned out, leaving nothing behind but ash and regret. Eleanor preferred to let her anger settle, to let it cool into something sharper and more useful. Her marriage to Alastair had never been built on affection. It had been built on arrangement, the kind so common among families like theirs, where love was considered a pleasant accident rather than a requirement. Eleanor's family, the Hartleys, had once held considerable land and influence, but a string of poor decisions by her late father had left them with more titles than money. The Whitmores, meanwhile, had money fading almost as quickly, along with a family name that still opened doors in London society. The marriage had made sense to everyone except, perhaps, to Eleanor herself. She had been 19 when she married Alastair, a young woman with sharp eyes and a mind for numbers that no one in her family had ever encouraged her to use. Her mother had taught her needlework and etiquette. It was her grandfather, a quiet man with a talent for business, who had secretly taught her how to read a ledger, how to understand interest and debt, how to see the difference between a family that looked wealthy and a family that actually was. That education had seemed like a small, useless gift at the time. It would later become the only thing standing between the Whitmore family and complete ruin. In the early years of her marriage, Eleanor had tried, in her own quiet way, to build something real with her husband. She had asked him about his day. She had listened to his complaints about his father's expectations and the burdens of managing an estate he had never truly wanted to inherit. She had believed, for a while, that patience and kindness might be enough to build affection where none had existed before. Alastair had other ideas of how to spend his time. He preferred the company of card tables and drinking halls to the quiet evenings Eleanor offered him. He preferred the admiration of strangers in London's gambling houses to the steady, unglamorous partnership of managing a home together. Every month, it seemed, another letter arrived demanding payment for some debt Eleanor had not known existed. Every month she found new ways to stretch what little money remained, canceling small luxuries, negotiating with tradesmen, quietly selling pieces of jewelry that had once belonged to her mother. Alastair never noticed the sacrifices. He only noticed when the sacrifices were not enough. "You manage the house as though we are paupers," he told her once, after she suggested reducing the number of servants employed at Ashcombe Hall. "People will talk." "People are already talking," Eleanor had replied, "about your debts, not mine." He had not appreciated the honesty. Alastair rarely did. It was around that time that Eleanor began speaking more often with Henry Colloway, the family's longtime solicitor, a careful and soft-spoken man who had served the Whitmore estate since Alastair's father was alive. Henry had always respected Eleanor, perhaps because she was the only member of the family who asked him real questions instead of simply signing whatever he placed in front of them. "The estate cannot survive another year like this one," Henry told her quietly one afternoon, in the small study that had once belonged to her father-in-law. "Your husband's debts are growing faster than the estate's income. If his creditors decide to act together, they could claim the house itself. Elinor had sat very still, absorbing the weight of his words. And what would happen to the people who live here? The staff, the tenants, the families who depend on this land. They would lose their homes as easily as your husband would lose his. It was not concern for Alastair that made Elinor act. It was concern for everyone else whose lives were tied, without their consent, to her husband's carelessness. The cook who had worked in the kitchens for 20 years, the stable boy whose family had served the estate for 3 generations, the tenant farmers whose harvests depended on the land remaining in careful hands. "There must be something that can be done," Elinor said. Henry hesitated before answering. "There is one possibility. It would require your husband's signature, and it would need to be done carefully, without drawing his full attention to the details." "Explain it to me." Henry laid out the plan slowly, the way a man explains something he knows carries risk. The estate could be restructured, its ownership transferred in part to Elinor's name, creating a legal barrier between the family home and Alastair's mounting debts. Creditors could pursue Alastair personally, but they could not touch property that belonged, on paper, to his wife. "It is not entirely honest," Henry admitted, "but it is not illegal either. Your husband would need to sign the documents himself. I cannot forge his hand." "He signs whatever is placed in front of him when he has had enough wine," Elinor said quietly. "He has never once asked me to explain a document to him. He believes reading contracts is beneath a man of his position." The plan felt, to Elinor, less like deception and more like a lifeboat quietly built while the ship above continued to leak. She did not enjoy the secrecy of it. She did not relish the thought of tricking her husband, even a man who had shown her so little respect. But she thought of the families whose futures depended on Ashcombe Hall remaining standing, and she found the courage to proceed. It took nearly 8 months to complete the transfer. Each document carefully timed to appear alongside other papers Alastair was already expected to sign: tax filings, tenant agreements, minor household matters he found tedious and beneath his attention. Late one evening, after a long dinner with wine that flowed generously, Henry arrived with a leather folder containing the final documents. "More papers," Alastair had groaned, barely glancing up from his glass. "Can this not wait until morning?" "It concerns the tenant leases for next season," Henry said smoothly. "A formality, my lord, nothing requiring your attention beyond a signature." Alastair had signed without reading a single line, exactly as Elinor had known he would. She remembered watching from the doorway that night, her heart pounding harder than she expected, as her husband unknowingly signed away the very foundation of his own power. She had felt no triumph in that moment, only a strange, heavy relief, the kind that comes after holding one's breath for far too long. It was not until months later, when Alastair's mistress began appearing more openly at social gatherings, that Elinor allowed herself to feel something closer to satisfaction about what she had done. She had not built her protection out of jealousy over Serafina Cole. She had built it long before Serafina ever entered her husband's life. But watching him grow bolder in his affair, watching him assume that his position and his home were untouchable regardless of how he behaved, Elinor began to understand that the protection she had built for practical reasons might one day serve a very different purpose. Charlotte Bramwell, Elinor's closest friend since childhood, had been the only person outside of Henry who knew the full truth of the arrangement. Charlotte had married into a modest but respectable family, and unlike many women of their circle, she had little patience for pretending everything was well when it clearly was not. "You could destroy him tomorrow if you wished," Charlotte had said one afternoon, as the two women walked through the gardens of Ashcombe Hall. "Why do you wait?" "Because destroying him accomplishes nothing if I do it out of anger," Elinor replied. "I want him to understand fully what he has done, not just to me, but to everyone who depends on this family." "And Serafina Cole?" Elinor had paused beside a bed of white roses, considering the question carefully. "She is not my concern. She is simply a woman who believed a man's promises, without asking what those promises were actually worth. Charlotte had studied her friend for a long moment, something between admiration and worry in her expression. "You have become someone I almost do not recognize, Eleanor." "I have become someone I needed to be," Eleanor answered, "nothing more." By the time the invitations for the grand autumn ball went out, Eleanor already knew, with quiet certainty, that her husband intended to make some kind of announcement involving Seraphina. She had heard the whispers among the staff, seen the excitement in Alastair's manner over the past weeks, noticed the new jewelry Seraphina had begun wearing in public, gifts that Eleanor recognized as pieces once belonging to Alastair's grandmother. She did not try to stop the ball from happening. She did not confront her husband privately, though she could have. Instead, she waited, the same way she had waited through years of quiet humiliation, gathering every piece of evidence, every document, every detail that would matter when the moment finally arrived. Because Eleanor understood something her husband never had. Power spoken quietly, and used at exactly the right moment, was far stronger than power shouted carelessly into a room that did not truly belong to the one shouting it. She simply had to wait for him to give her the moment himself. And on the night of the ball, standing beneath the same golden chandeliers her husband believed were his to command, Alastair Whitmore did exactly that. The silence that followed Eleanor's departure did not last long. The moment she disappeared through the crowd, the ballroom erupted into a storm of whispers, so loud and sudden that it sounded almost like the return of the orchestra. Fans snapped open and closed. Gloved hands covered mouths in exaggerated shock. Lords leaned toward their wives to murmur theories, and wives leaned toward each other to share suspicions they had apparently been holding for months. Alastair stood frozen at the top of the staircase, Seraphina beside him, both of them suddenly aware that every eye in the room had shifted from admiration to something far less comfortable. "What did she mean?" Seraphina asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly beneath the noise of the crowd. "What papers was she talking about?" "Nothing," Alastair said quickly, though his own voice lacked its earlier confidence. "My wife enjoys theatrics. She has always had a flair for drama when she feels ignored." But even as he said the words, doubt had already begun creeping into his chest, cold and unfamiliar. He tried to recall the documents Henry had brought to him over the past year, tried to remember any detail beyond the dullness of legal language and the relief of finishing supper so he could return to more interesting company. He could not remember specifics. He had never asked for specifics. Specifics, he had always believed, were for men who did not trust their own position. For the first time in his life, Alastair began to wonder if that belief had been a mistake. "My lord," came a voice from the edge of the staircase. Alastair turned to see Henry Calloway standing quietly among the guests, his expression carefully neutral, the way a solicitor's expression always remains neutral even when carrying devastating news. Henry had been invited to the ball as a long-time family associate, though few guests understood that his presence tonight was no coincidence. "Henry," Alastair said, forcing calm into his voice, "perhaps you can clarify something for our guests. My wife seems to believe there is some confusion regarding the ownership of this estate." Henry's gaze flickered briefly toward the door through which Eleanor had disappeared, then returned to Alastair. "I believe, my lord, that the Duchess understands the matter with complete clarity." The words landed heavier than Henry likely intended, and a fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alastair felt heat rising in his neck, the particular heat of a man realizing, slowly and publicly, that he might not know his own life as well as he had assumed. "Speak plainly," Alastair said, his jaw tightening. Henry hesitated, glancing briefly at the guests still watching with undisguised curiosity. "Perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a private room, my lord." "I asked you to speak plainly," Alastair repeated, louder now, drawing even more attention from the surrounding crowd. Pride, it seemed, had already overtaken caution. Henry exhaled slowly. "Very well. Approximately 2 years ago, you signed a series of documents restructuring the ownership of several family properties, including Ashcombe Hall. Those documents transferred primary ownership of the estate to the Duchess, as a protective measure against outstanding debts held in your name. The room fell utterly silent, save for the faint creak of the great chandeliers swaying gently overhead. "That is not possible," Alastair said, though his voice had lost nearly all of its earlier authority. "I would remember signing away my own family's estate." "You signed it, my lord, believing it concerned tenant leases," Henry said carefully. "I do not say this to embarrass you. I say it because you have asked me to speak plainly, and the Duchess's earlier statement was, unfortunately, entirely accurate." Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a young lord let out a short, disbelieving laugh, quickly muffled behind his glove. Others exchanged glances that ranged from pity to poorly hidden amusement. The story of the evening had shifted entirely, from a duke announcing a new duchess to a duke discovering, in front of the very people he had hoped to impress, that his own signature had quietly undone him. Seraphina's hand slipped fully away from Alastair's arm now, her earlier pride replaced by something closer to panic. She had spent months imagining herself as the mistress of Ashcombe Hall, hosting balls exactly like this one, wearing jewels that belonged to a family whose name would soon be hers. She had not imagined standing in the middle of a room watching that entire future collapse in the space of a few sentences. "Alastair," she said quietly, though her voice carried further than she intended in the newly hushed room, "tell me this is not true." Alastair did not answer immediately. He was staring at Henry as though the solicitor himself had betrayed him, though in truth, Henry had done nothing more than follow instructions given to him by the only member of the Whitmore family who had ever bothered to ask the right questions. "Get everyone out," Alastair finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "This conversation is over." But conversations rarely end simply because the most powerful person in the room wishes them to, especially when that person has just been revealed to hold far less power than he believed. From near the entrance of the ballroom, a new voice spoke, calm and measured, cutting through the tension with practiced ease. "There is no need to send anyone away on my account." Elinor had returned. She walked back through the parting crowd exactly as she had walked through it before, unhurried, composed, the leather folder no longer in her hands but a single sealed envelope instead. She stopped a respectful distance from her husband and his mistress, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to make it plain that she had not returned to beg or plead. "I apologize for the interruption to the evening," Elinor said, addressing the guests directly now, her voice carrying the warmth of a hostess rather than the coldness of a wronged wife. "I know many of you traveled a great distance to attend tonight's celebration, and I would hate for the evening to end on nothing but confusion." A few guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to feel relieved or more alarmed. "My husband made an announcement earlier this evening regarding the future of Ashcombe Hall," Elinor continued. "I believe it is only fair that I offer a correction, so that no one leaves tonight with the wrong understanding of the facts." She held up the sealed envelope. "This letter contains a full account of the estate's current ownership, verified by our family solicitor and prepared for public record. I'm not sharing this to embarrass my husband, though I understand it may feel that way to him. I am sharing it because many of you have business connections, family alliances, and financial interests tied to this household, and you deserve to know exactly whose word carries weight within it." The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, attentive rather than shocked, respectful rather than merely curious. "Ashcombe Hall, along with its surrounding lands and the majority of the family's remaining assets, is held in my name," Elinor said plainly. "This was arranged not out of malice, but out of necessity, following a series of financial difficulties that threatened not only this family's future, but the futures of everyone who depends upon this estate for their livelihood." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "I share this tonight not to punish my husband for his announcement, though I admit his timing left something to be desired," she said, a faint, dry humor creeping into her voice that drew a few unexpected chuckles from the crowd, easing the tension just slightly. I share it because a promise made about a house one does not own is not truly a promise at all. It is simply a wish, spoken aloud in the hope that no one will ask the obvious question. Serafina's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence entirely drained. She glanced toward Alistair, perhaps hoping he might say something to salvage the moment, but he remained silent, staring at his wife with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something that almost resembled respect, though he would never have admitted it aloud. "I do not ask any of you to take sides tonight," Elinor continued, addressing the room once more. "I only ask that you enjoy the evening for what it truly is, a celebration of good company, good food, and good music, regardless of whatever else has been said within these walls." With that, she gave a small, gracious nod to the musicians standing near the edge of the room, silently signaling them to resume playing. After a moment of hesitation, the orchestra began again, tentative at first, then gradually filling the hall with music once more. The guests, given permission to move past the discomfort of the moment, began to shift back into conversation, though the topic of every conversation had changed entirely. No longer did anyone discuss the season's fashions or the latest political gossip from London. Every whispered exchange now centered on the Duchess of Ashcombe, the woman who had somehow, quietly and without a single raised voice, revealed herself to be far more powerful than anyone had ever suspected. Alistair remained standing near the top of the staircase, watching his guests slowly return to their evening as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though his entire understanding of his own life had not just been rearranged in front of them. "Elinor," he said quietly, stepping toward her once the immediate crowd had thinned, "we need to speak, privately." "We will speak," Elinor said, her tone neither warm nor cruel, "but not tonight. Tonight belongs to our guests." She turned from him then, moving gracefully through the crowd, accepting compliments on the evening's arrangements, as though the events of the past half-hour had been nothing more than a minor disruption in an otherwise perfectly hosted ball. Serafina, left standing alone near the staircase, watched Elinor's retreating figure with an expression that had shifted from panic into something colder, something closer to calculation. She had come to this ball believing herself on the edge of becoming one of the most powerful women in the region. She was leaving it with the uncomfortable understanding that the woman she had helped humiliate might, in fact, already hold that position entirely. Near the edge of the room, Charlotte Bramwell allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she watched her friend move confidently through the crowd greeting guests, laughing softly at their compliments, behaving exactly as a woman should behave in her own home. Because that was precisely what Ashcombe Hall was. Elinor's home. And by the end of the evening, every guest in that ballroom understood it, whether they wished to or not. By morning, the story of the Ashcombe Ball had already reached every corner of London society. Alistair sat alone in his study, the same room where he had once signed away his own authority without a second thought, staring at a stack of newspapers his valet had reluctantly delivered. The gossip columns had wasted no time. One paper described the evening as a most extraordinary reversal of fortune, while another simply printed, in bold letters, "Who truly rules Ashcombe Hall?" He had not slept. He had spent most of the night pacing the halls of a house he was beginning to understand was no longer his to pace, replaying the moment Henry Calloway had confirmed, in front of 300 witnesses, that his wife owned everything he had built his entire identity upon. It was not simply the loss of property that unsettled him. It was the realization that Elinor, the woman he had dismissed for years as quiet and unremarkable, had been quietly outmaneuvering him the entire time, and he had never once noticed. A knock came at the study door. "Enter," Alistair said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Henry stepped inside, holding a small stack of documents against his chest. He looked, as always, calm and composed, though there was a careful distance in his manner that had not existed before last night. "You wish to see me, my lord," Henry said. "Sit down," Alistair said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Henry did so, setting the documents on the desk between them without comment. "I want you to explain to me, in complete detail, exactly what I signed," Alastair said. "I want to understand precisely how much of my life no longer belongs to me." Henry opened the folder and began speaking with the careful patience of a man who had explained difficult truths many times before. He detailed the properties transferred, the accounts restructured, the legal protections built into every document to ensure they could not easily be reversed. As he spoke, Alastair's expression shifted from anger to disbelief, and finally into something quieter, something closer to shame. "Why did you not tell me?" Alastair asked when Henry finished. "You have served this family for years. Why would you help her deceive me?" Henry considered the question carefully before answering. "With respect, my lord, I did not deceive you. I placed documents before you and explained each time what they concerned. You chose not to read them. That choice was yours, not mine, and not the Duchess's. You could have insisted." "I did insist more than once in the early days," Henry said. "You told me that reading contracts was a task better suited to men who had nothing better to do with their time." Alastair fell silent, the memory of his own words returning to him with an unwelcome clarity. He had said exactly that more than once, proud of his own carelessness, believing it a sign of confidence rather than the risk it truly was. "The Duchess did not act out of malice," Henry continued. "She acted to protect this estate from creditors who would have taken everything, including the roof over the heads of nearly 40 families who depend upon this land. Whatever you may think of her methods, my lord, you should know that without her actions, Ashcombe Hall would likely no longer exist at all." The words settled heavily in the room. Alastair stared down at the documents in front of him, his own signature staring back at him from page after page, evidence of a carelessness he could no longer deny. "Is there any way to reverse this?" he asked finally. Henry shook his head slowly. "The documents were prepared with great care, my lord. Any attempt to challenge them in court would require proving the Duchess acted fraudulently, which she did not. It would also require revealing, in great detail, the extent of your gambling debts and the reasons the restructuring was necessary in the first place. I would not advise such a path." Alastair sat back in his chair, feeling, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, entirely powerless within his own home. Later that afternoon, he sought out Eleanor in the small sitting room she had always preferred, a quiet space overlooking the eastern gardens where she often took her tea alone. She was seated near the window when he entered, a book resting closed in her lap, her expression unreadable as she watched him approach. "I assume you have spoken with Henry," she said before he could begin. "I have," Alastair said, closing the door behind him. "I want to understand why you did not simply tell me, years ago, what you had done." "Would you have listened?" Eleanor asked. "Would you have taken it seriously? Or would you have dismissed it as another example of your wife worrying over matters that did not concern her?" Alastair opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, uncertain how to answer honestly. "I did not do this to punish you," Eleanor continued, setting her book aside. "I did it because someone in this family needed to think beyond the next card game, the next evening at the club, the next flattering smile from someone who wanted something from you. I did not enjoy deceiving you, Alastair, but I have grown very tired of watching you deceive yourself." "And Seraphina," he asked quietly, "did you know about her from the beginning?" "I knew before you believed I did," Eleanor said. "I said nothing, because I understood that confronting you privately would accomplish little. You would have apologized, promised to change, and continued exactly as before. I have watched you make that same promise more than once." Alastair's shoulders sank slightly, the fight draining out of him as he recognized the truth in her words. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Eleanor said, "you have a choice to make. You can continue believing that your name alone should be enough to command respect, or you can begin to understand that respect, like ownership, must actually be earned rather than assumed. And if I choose to fight you, to challenge this in court, to attempt to reclaim what you have taken, then you will lose," Elinor said simply, without malice, as though stating a fact about the weather. And you will lose publicly, in a manner far more damaging than anything that happened at the ball last night. I would rather you did not choose that path, Alistair, not out of concern for myself, but out of concern for the family name you claim to care so deeply about. He studied her for a long moment, searching for some sign of the woman he had married, the quiet, obedient girl who had once accepted his neglect without complaint. He did not find her. In her place sat someone entirely different, someone who had, without his notice, become the true head of the household he had spent his life taking for granted. "I do not know this version of you," he said finally. "Perhaps," Elinor replied, "because you never took the time to know any version of me at all." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Alistair rose slowly from where he stood, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of everything he had lost, not simply property or position, but years of a partnership he had never bothered to build. As he turned to leave, Elinor spoke once more, her voice quieter now, though no less certain. "I am not interested in destroying you, Alistair. I never was. But I will not allow you, or anyone else, to stand in my home and speak as though my patience these past years was weakness rather than restraint." He did not respond. There was nothing left to say that would not sound hollow after everything that had already been spoken between them. That evening, as word continued to spread through London's drawing rooms and private clubs, Alistair received a visit he had not expected. Seraphina arrived at Ashcombe Hall shortly after sunset, her carriage pulling up the long drive with none of the confidence it had carried the night before. He met her in the small parlor near the entrance, aware that every servant in the house was likely already whispering about her arrival. "I need to understand what this means for us," Seraphina said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "For the future you promised me." Alistair looked at her for a long moment, seeing, perhaps for the first time, not the woman he had imagined building a new life with, but simply another consequence of choices he had made without ever considering their true cost. "I do not know what it means," he admitted quietly. "I do not know what I have left to offer anyone." Seraphina's expression hardened, disappointment curdling quickly into something colder. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should have discovered that before making promises to me in front of 300 witnesses." She left without another word, her carriage disappearing down the long drive into the darkness, leaving Alistair alone once more in a house that, despite everything he had once believed, had never truly belonged to him at all. Seraphina Cole had not always dreamed of becoming a duchess. Before Alistair Whitmore entered her life, she had been the daughter of a modestly successful merchant, raised in a comfortable but unremarkable home on the outskirts of London. Her family had never lacked for necessities, but they had always lacked the one thing that mattered most in the circles she longed to enter, a title that would open doors no amount of money ever could. She had met Alistair at a charity gathering nearly 2 years earlier, one of those carefully arranged social events where wealthy merchants' daughters were permitted brief access to the aristocracy, so long as everyone understood the arrangement was purely temporary. Seraphina had worn her finest gown that evening, practiced her curtsy in the mirror for hours beforehand, and rehearsed conversation topics she believed would make her seem clever without seeming forward. She had not expected the Duke of Ashcombe himself to seek her out. Alistair had been charming that night, generous with compliments, attentive in a way that made her feel, for the first time in her life, as though she belonged somewhere beyond the boundaries of her own modest background. He spoke of his family's long history, the grandeur of Ashcombe Hall, the responsibilities he carried as a man of his position. He did not mention, of course, the debts that had already begun consuming that grandeur from the inside. Seraphina had fallen for the version of Alistair he presented that evening, the confident duke who seemed to move through the world without hesitation or doubt. She had not fallen for the real man underneath, the one who avoided difficult conversations, who signed away his own future without reading the words in front of him, who mistook charm for competence and confidence for control. By the time she understood the difference, She had already built an entire future around him. Their relationship had developed slowly at first, carefully hidden from public view, meetings arranged in quiet corners of the city where neither of their reputations could be easily damaged. Alastair had spoken often of his unhappy marriage, of a wife he described as cold and distant, more interested in household accounts than in him. Seraphina had believed every word, sympathizing with a man she imagined trapped in a loveless arrangement, waiting only for the right circumstances to finally claim the happiness he deserved. She had never once considered that the cold, distant wife might be the only reason the family still had a roof over its head. As months passed, Alastair's promises grew bolder. He spoke of arranging a legal separation from Eleanor, of securing an annulment through connections in the church, of eventually making Seraphina his lawful wife and the rightful mistress of Ashcombe Hall. Seraphina had allowed herself to believe every word, in part because she wanted desperately to believe them, and in part because Alastair had always seemed like a man entirely certain of his own power. She understood now, sitting alone in her family's modest drawing room the morning after the disastrous ball, that certainty and truth were not the same thing at all. Her mother, Margaret Cole, entered the room quietly, carrying a tray of tea she set down without a word. She had heard, of course, about the events of the previous evening. All of London had heard by now. "You do not have to speak of it if you are not ready," Margaret said gently, taking a seat across from her daughter. "Everyone already knows," Seraphina said, her voice flat, drained of the confidence it had carried for the past year. "There is little point in pretending otherwise." Margaret studied her daughter for a long moment before speaking again. "I did warn you, Seraphina, when this began. Married men rarely leave their wives for the woman waiting outside the marriage. They leave when it becomes convenient for them, and only then." "He said he loved me," Seraphina said quietly. "Perhaps he believed he did," Margaret replied. "But love without honesty is simply another kind of performance, and performances end the moment the audience stops watching." Seraphina said nothing, staring into her teacup as though it might offer some answer to the question consuming her thoughts. What was she now, if not the future Duchess of Ashcombe Hall? A woman who had publicly humiliated a duchess she had never even properly met, only to discover that the Duchess held all the power in the household she had hoped to claim as her own. The thought of Eleanor Whitmore, standing calm and composed in that ballroom while chaos erupted around her, lingered uncomfortably in Seraphina's mind. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, to see the wife reduced to tears, perhaps fleeing the room in humiliation. She had not expected to watch a woman dismantle her husband's entire announcement, with nothing more than a few carefully chosen words and a sealed envelope. There had been no anger in Eleanor's voice, no desperation, only the quiet, unshakable certainty of someone who had known, long before that evening began, exactly how the night would end. Seraphina found herself, despite everything, unable to hate the woman entirely. Later that week, as the gossip surrounding the ball began to fade into other, newer scandals, Seraphina received an unexpected letter delivered by a servant she did not recognize. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant, precise, unmistakably belonging to someone of considerable education. She opened it carefully, half expecting some cruel message from Eleanor, some final humiliation delivered in writing rather than in person. Instead, the letter contained something entirely different. "Lady Cole, I understand that the events of the recent ball have left you in a difficult position, one that was, in many ways, not entirely of your own making. I do not write to condemn you further, nor do I write out of any desire to see you suffer for choices made by a man who should have known better than to make promises he had no right to keep. I write instead to offer a small piece of advice, should you choose to accept it. A future built upon another person's carelessness is never truly secure, regardless of how confident that person may appear. I would encourage you to consider what future you might build for yourself, independent of any man's promises, however sincerely they may have been spoken. I hold no ill will toward you personally. You were, I believe, as deceived by my husband's confidence as I once was myself. E. Whitmore. Serafina read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for some hidden cruelty beneath the measured words. She found none. The letter was, if anything, kinder than she had any right to expect from a woman she had helped humiliate in front of half of London society. She sat with the letter for a long while, feeling something shift uncomfortably in her chest, something that resembled shame more than anger. "What has come for you?" Margaret asked, noticing her daughter's stillness. "A letter," Serafina said quietly, "from the Duchess of Ashcombe." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What does she want?" "Nothing," Serafina said. "She wants nothing from me at all." That evening, alone in her room, Serafina found herself thinking not of Alastair, whose letters had gone unanswered since the night of the ball, but of Elinor, and the strange, unexpected respect she felt building toward a woman she had once dismissed as an obstacle standing between her and the future she wanted. She began to understand, slowly and painfully, that she had spent nearly 2 years chasing a title rather than a genuine partnership, a house rather than a home, the appearance of security rather than security itself. Alastair had offered her exactly what he had always offered everyone in his life: confidence without substance, promises without foundation, charm without the willingness to earn what that charm implied. She had allowed herself to be dazzled by the same qualities that had nearly destroyed his entire family's fortune. In the days that followed, Serafina began quietly distancing herself from the social circles that had once celebrated her rising status as Alastair's companion. She declined invitations to gatherings where she knew she would be discussed rather than welcomed. She spent more time with her family, more time considering what kind of future she actually wanted. Separate entirely from the fantasy she had built around a man who had never truly seen her as anything more than a pleasant escape from his own responsibilities. It would take time before she understood the full shape of the life she wanted to build, but she understood, at least, what she no longer wanted. She no longer wanted to be anyone's secret. She no longer wanted to build her future on promises made by a man too careless to read his own documents. And she no longer wanted to measure her worth by a title that had never truly been within Alastair's power to give her in the first place. Meanwhile, at Ashcombe Hall, Elinor received word through Charlotte that Serafina had begun withdrawing from public life, declining the very invitations that would have once thrilled her only months before. "Do you feel any satisfaction in that?" Charlotte asked, as the two women sat together in the garden, the autumn air cool and crisp around them. Elinor considered the question carefully before answering. "No," she said finally. "I feel only that a young woman was given a very expensive lesson about the value of promises made by men who have never had to earn anything for themselves. I hope she learns from it. I do not need her to suffer for it." "You are more generous than most women would be in your position," Charlotte said. "Generosity was never the point," Elinor replied. "Clarity was. I wanted everyone in that ballroom, including her, to understand exactly what my husband's promises were actually worth. What she chooses to do with that understanding now belongs entirely to her." Charlotte smiled faintly, watching her friend with the same quiet admiration she had carried since the night of the ball. "And what do you intend to do now, Elinor? With Alastair, with the estate, with everything that comes next?" Elinor looked out toward the gardens, toward the hall standing tall and steady behind them, a house that had nearly been lost entirely to carelessness and pride, saved instead by patience and quiet determination. "Now," she said, "I intend to make certain that whatever comes next belongs entirely to the people who actually earned it." Within 2 weeks, the story of the Ashcombe ball had become the most discussed event of the entire season. It traveled through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs, through carriage rides and afternoon visits, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling, though the core of the story remained unchanged. A duke had announced his mistress as the next Duchess, only to discover, in front of his own guests, that his wife owned the very house in which he made the announcement. For a man who had spent his entire life relying on charm and reputation, The damage to Alastair's standing was immediate and severe. Invitations that had once arrived weekly at Ashcombe Hall slowed to a trickle, then stopped almost entirely. Friends who had spent years enjoying Alastair's hospitality, drinking his wine, and losing gracefully to him at cards, suddenly found themselves too busy to accept his company. It was not that they believed him a villain, exactly. It was simply that association with a man so thoroughly humiliated carried its own social cost, one few were willing to pay. Lord Pemberton, a longtime friend of the Whitmore family, put it plainly during a private conversation with another gentleman at their usual club. "It is not the mistress that troubles people," Pemberton admitted, swirling the brandy in his glass. "Half the men in this room have kept mistresses at some point. It is the carelessness of it all. A man ought to at least know what he owns before he starts giving pieces of it away in front of witnesses." His companion chuckled softly. "They say the Duchess has not raised her voice once through the entire affair, simply produced a letter and let the truth do the work for her." "That is precisely what makes it so uncomfortable," Pemberton replied. "A man can defend himself against anger. It is far harder to defend himself against quiet, patient competence." Word of such conversations inevitably made their way back to Alastair, each one landing like another small wound atop the larger injury to his pride. He had built his entire identity around being a man others respected, admired, even envied. Watching that respect evaporate, replaced by quiet amusement and careful distance, proved far more painful than he had anticipated. His mother, the Dowager Lady Whitmore, arrived at Ashcombe Hall less than a month after the ball, having heard the news through a network of correspondence that stretched across half of England. She was a formidable woman, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, who had run the estate herself during the early years of her own widowhood before handing its management to a son she had always hoped would grow into the responsibility. She found Alastair in his study, surrounded by unopened correspondence he had been avoiding for days. "I did not raise you to embarrass this family in front of 300 witnesses," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Mother, please." "I am not finished," she interrupted, her voice sharp enough to silence him immediately. "I raised you to understand that a title without responsibility is worthless. I watched your father make careless mistakes throughout his life, and I hoped, foolishly it seems, that you might learn from watching the consequences rather than repeating them yourself." Alastair sat in silence, unable to argue with words he had already heard, in different forms, from nearly everyone he respected. "Your wife," his mother continued, "has done more to protect this family in the past 2 years than you have accomplished in your entire adult life. I do not say this to wound you further, though I imagine it will. I say it because someone in this family needs to speak the truth plainly, and it seems your solicitor and your wife have already exhausted their patience for doing so gently." "You approve of what she did?" Alastair asked, a note of disbelief entering his voice. "Deceiving me, taking the estate from beneath my own hands." "I approve of the fact that this house still exists," his mother replied firmly. "I approve of the fact that the tenants who depend on this land still have homes to return to each evening. Whether her methods were entirely honest is a separate question, and one I suspect she has already wrestled with far more than you have given her credit for." She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with the same brisk efficiency she had once used to manage the estate's accounts. "You have a choice ahead of you, Alastair," she said, pausing at the door. "You can spend the coming months resenting your wife for saving what you nearly destroyed, or you can spend them learning, finally, what it actually means to be responsible for the people who depend upon you. I would strongly advise the second path, though I have little confidence you will choose it." She left without waiting for a response, leaving Alastair alone once more with the weight of a truth he could no longer avoid. Meanwhile, Eleanor's standing within society had transformed just as dramatically, though in the opposite direction. Where once she had been dismissed as quiet, unremarkable, more comfortable with ledgers than conversation, she was now spoken of with a mixture of curiosity and genuine admiration. Women who had never before sought her company began requesting visits, eager to hear, in whatever careful detail she was willing to share, how she had managed to outmaneuver her husband so completely without ever raising her voice. Alina accepted these new social invitations with characteristic composure, neither seeking the attention nor avoiding it entirely. She understood that the sudden interest in her company had less to do with genuine affection and more to do with curiosity about power, but she also recognized an opportunity within that curiosity. "You have become quite fashionable," Charlotte observed one afternoon, as the two women reviewed a stack of invitations that had arrived that week alone. "I imagine you find it somewhat amusing, given how little attention you received before." "I find it useful," Alina replied simply. "Fashionable women are listened to. I intend to use that attention wisely." "For what purpose?" Alina set down the invitation she had been reading and looked at her friend directly. "There are decisions ahead of me, Charlotte, regarding the estate, regarding my marriage, regarding the future of everyone who depends upon Ashcombe Hall. It will be far easier to make those decisions with the support of society behind me, rather than against me." It was during this period that Alina began meeting more regularly with Henry, reviewing not only the immediate situation with Alastair, but the long-term future of the estate itself. She had spent years learning to manage the family's finances out of necessity. Now, for the first time, she began to consider what she might build if given the freedom to make decisions entirely on her own terms. "The tenant farms have suffered from years of neglect," she told Henry during one such meeting, reviewing a set of ledgers spread across the study desk. "I would like to invest in improvements to the irrigation systems and perhaps establish a small school for the tenants' children." Henry glanced up from the documents, mild surprise crossing his usually composed features. "Those are significant investments, Your Grace. Are you certain the estate's finances can support such expansion so soon after the difficulties of recent years?" "I have reviewed the numbers carefully," Alina said. "We can support modest improvements now, with more substantial investment possible once the harvest season concludes. I do not intend to rebuild this estate simply to preserve it as it was. I intend to make it stronger than it has ever been." Henry allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first Alina had seen from him since the difficulties began. "It seems, Your Grace, that you have given this a great deal of thought." "I have had a great deal of time to think," Alina replied. "Years of it, in fact, spent managing a household while being told my opinions mattered little beyond the walls of this study. I do not intend to waste the opportunity now that circumstances have changed." As autumn deepened into the early days of winter, the distance between Alina and Alastair within Ashcombe Hall grew more pronounced, though never openly hostile. They occupied the same house, attended the same occasional family obligations, maintained the appearance of civility for the sake of the staff and any visiting relatives. But the quiet warmth that had once, however faintly, existed between them had disappeared entirely, replaced by a careful, formal distance neither seemed inclined to bridge. Alastair, for his part, had begun spending less time at his usual clubs and gambling houses, though whether from genuine reflection or simply the discomfort of facing former friends who now viewed him with quiet amusement, even Henry could not say for certain. He had taken, instead, to walking the estate's grounds alone in the mornings, observing the tenant farms and the surrounding lands with an attention he had never previously bothered to give them. It was during one such walk that he encountered Alina near the eastern fields, discussing irrigation improvements with two of the estate's longtime farmers. He watched from a distance for several minutes, observing the ease with which she spoke with the men, the genuine respect in their manner toward her, the confidence with which she discussed matters he had never once considered worth his attention. He did not approach. He simply watched, understanding with growing discomfort exactly how much of his own estate he had never truly known at all. That evening, as Alina returned to the house, she found Alastair waiting near the entrance, an unusual formality in his posture that suggested he had rehearsed whatever he intended to say. "I saw you with the tenant farmers today," he said, "discussing the irrigation systems." I did not realize you were watching, Elena replied, though there was no accusation in her tone. I have been watching a great deal these past weeks, Alastair admitted, more than I ever bothered to before. Elena studied him carefully, searching for the familiar carelessness that had once defined nearly everything about him. She found, instead, something quieter, something that might, with time, become genuine humility, though she remained cautious about placing too much hope in a change so recent. "What is it you wish to say, Alastair?" she asked. He hesitated, choosing his words with unfamiliar care. "I wish to understand, if you are willing to teach me, what it actually means to manage this estate properly. Not to reclaim what you have built, Elena. I understand that is no longer mine to reclaim, but to understand it at least, so that I am no longer simply a name attached to a house I never truly cared for." It was, Elena recognized, the first genuinely honest request her husband had made of her in the entirety of their marriage. She did not answer immediately. Some decisions, she had learned, deserved careful consideration rather than quick reassurance. "We will speak further," she said finally, "once I have decided what role, if any, remains for you within this household going forward." She left him standing at the entrance, the same quiet, unhurried grace in her steps that had carried her through the ballroom weeks earlier, leaving Alastair once again with far more to consider than he had ever bothered to consider before. 3 weeks after their conversation near the entrance hall, Elena summoned Alastair to the study for a meeting she had prepared carefully, with the same patience she had once used to build the very documents that now protected everything she had worked to save. Henry sat quietly to one side of the room, a fresh set of papers arranged neatly on the desk between them. Alastair arrived precisely on time, dressed with more restraint than he had shown in months, his usual confidence replaced by a wary attentiveness that had not existed in him before the events of the ball. "Thank you for coming," Elena said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "I believe it is time we discuss the future of this marriage and of your place within this household in clear and practical terms." Alastair sat down slowly, glancing briefly at Henry before returning his attention to his wife. "I am listening," he said. "I have considered this carefully over the past weeks," Elena began, "and I have arrived at 2 possible paths forward. I will explain both fully, and you will have the opportunity to choose which suits you best. I ask only that, whichever you choose, you commit to it fully, without the half-measures that have defined so much of your life until now." Alastair nodded, saying nothing, though the tension in his shoulders suggested he understood the seriousness of the moment. "The first path," Elena continued, "is a quiet separation. You would retain a respectable allowance, sufficient to live comfortably, though not lavishly, in a residence of your choosing away from Ashcombe Hall. The details of the separation would remain private, shared only with immediate family and essential legal parties. Publicly, we would simply allow the natural course of society's attention to move on to other matters, as it inevitably does." "And the second path?" Alastair asked. "The second path," Elena said, her voice remaining calm and even, "would involve a full and public account of the circumstances leading to our separation, including the extent of your gambling debts, the details of your relationship with Lady Cole, and the reasons the estate's ownership was restructured in the first place. I would not enjoy pursuing this path, Alastair, but I assure you I am fully prepared to do so if necessary." Alastair's jaw tightened, old pride flaring briefly before settling once more into the quieter resignation that had characterized him since the ball. "You are offering me dignity, in exchange for cooperation." "I am offering you a choice," Elena corrected gently. "What you make of that choice is entirely your own decision." Henry cleared his throat softly, drawing both their attention. "If I may add, my lord, the first path also allows for the possibility of continued involvement in certain estate matters, should the Duchess find your contributions genuinely valuable going forward. It is not necessarily a complete severing of your role here, simply a restructuring of its terms." Alastair glanced at Elena, surprise flickering across his features. "You would allow that, after everything?" "I have never wished to erase you entirely from this estate's future," Elinor said. "I have wished only for honesty, and for a genuine contribution, rather than empty authority borrowed from a name you never bothered to earn the responsibility behind. If you are willing to learn, truly learn, the work required to manage this land and the people who depend upon it, there may yet be a place for you here, though not the place you once assumed was yours by simple birthright." Alastair sat in silence for a long moment, considering her words carefully. He thought of the tenant farmers he had watched Elinor speak with weeks earlier, the genuine respect in their manner toward her, a respect he had never once earned from anyone during his years as Duke. He thought of his mother's blunt assessment of his failures, of Henry's careful patience in explaining truths he had long avoided, of Seraphina's silence in the weeks since the ball, a silence that told him more clearly than any letter could have that whatever they had shared had never been built on anything solid enough to survive real difficulty. "I choose the first path," he said finally, "not simply for the sake of my own comfort, but because I would like the opportunity, if you are willing to extend it, to become someone worth the trust you are describing." Elinor studied him carefully, searching his expression for the familiar carelessness she had grown accustomed to over the years of their marriage. She found, instead, something that resembled genuine intention, however fragile and untested it remained. "Very well," she said. "We will proceed with the separation as outlined. You will take residence at the smaller property near Thornfield, sufficient for comfortable living without excess. Should you wish to involve yourself in estate matters going forward, you will do so under Henry's guidance, learning the responsibilities properly rather than assuming them by title alone." "And Lady Cole," Alastair asked quietly, "what becomes of any arrangement between us?" "That," Elinor said, "is a matter entirely between yourself and Lady Cole. I have no authority over your personal relationships, only over the practical realities of this estate and this household. I would advise, however, that any future relationship you pursue be built on considerably more honesty than the one you shared with her." Alastair nodded slowly, understanding settling over him with a weight that felt, for the first time, less like punishment and more like the beginning of an entirely different kind of responsibility. Henry began arranging the necessary documents for the formal separation, each page far more carefully explained to Alastair than any document had been in the years preceding the ball. This time, Alastair read every line himself, asking questions where the language remained unclear, taking notes in a small journal he had begun keeping since his mother's visit weeks earlier. "You are asking a great many questions," Henry observed, mild approval evident in his tone. "I have decided," Alastair said, "that I would rather understand my own life fully, even if the understanding arrives too late to change certain outcomes, than continue living in the comfortable ignorance that nearly destroyed everything I claimed to value." The formal arrangements took several more weeks to finalize, during which time Alastair began, tentatively at first, to involve himself in the practical management of the estate's remaining responsibilities under his care. He accompanied Henry on visits to tenant farms, asking questions about crop yields and seasonal challenges he had never previously bothered to understand. He reviewed household accounts alongside Elinor's careful records, beginning to grasp, slowly and often uncomfortably, the sheer scope of what his wife had managed quietly for years while he pursued far less demanding pleasures. It was not a swift transformation, nor a complete one. Old habits surfaced occasionally, moments of impatience or wounded pride when confronted with tasks he found tedious or humbling. But the change, however gradual, proved genuine enough that even Elinor, cautious as she remained, began to notice a difference in her husband's manner that had not existed before. News of the separation, once finalized, spread through society with considerably less scandal than the events of the ball itself had generated. Most within their circle had already assumed some form of separation was inevitable, and the quiet, dignified manner in which it was ultimately handled did little to reignite the intense gossip that had followed the initial revelation. Alastair took residence at Thornfield as agreed, a modest but comfortable property several miles from Ashcombe Hall, sufficient for a quieter life than he had previously known, though far from the desperate poverty his careless debts had once threatened to bring upon the entire family. He visited Ashcombe Hall periodically in the following months, always with genuine purpose rather than empty social obligation, continuing his gradual education in estate management under Henry's patient guidance. His conversations with Alina during these visits remained formal, careful, though gradually losing some of the sharp distance that had characterized the immediate aftermath of the ball. "You have changed," Charlotte observed to Alina one afternoon, watching from the garden as Alastair reviewed a set of tenant reports with unusual focus near the study window. "Or perhaps I should say he has changed. I did not expect that outcome, given everything that happened." "I did not expect it either," Alina admitted. "I offered him the choice believing he would likely choose comfort over genuine effort, as he had done throughout most of our marriage. I am pleasantly surprised to find myself mistaken, at least so far." "Do you believe the change will last?" Charlotte asked. Alina considered the question carefully, watching her husband through the window as he made careful notes in his small journal, a habit that would have seemed entirely foreign to the man who had once dismissed reading contracts as beneath his attention. "I do not know," she said honestly. "But I have learned over these past difficult months that people are capable of far more genuine change than I once believed possible, provided they are given both the necessity and the opportunity to pursue it honestly. Whether Alastair continues along this path remains entirely his own responsibility now, not mine." As winter settled fully over the estate, bringing with it the quiet stillness that always accompanied the season's arrival, Alina found herself, for the first time in years, looking toward the future with something that resembled genuine hope rather than mere careful management of difficult circumstances. The estate was stronger than it had been in years. The tenant families who depended upon it were beginning to see real improvements to their homes and livelihoods, and whatever remained of her marriage to Alastair, however altered from what either of them had once imagined, had at least become something built on honesty rather than convenient illusion. It was, Alina reflected, a far more solid foundation than the one she had started with all those years ago. A full year passed before Ashcombe Hall hosted another grand ball. Alina had considered, more than once, whether to hold such an event at all, given the memories still attached to the last one. But Charlotte had convinced her, over several patient conversations, that reclaiming the tradition on her own terms would say more about the strength of her position than avoiding it ever could. "Let them see what this house has become under your care," Charlotte had said. "Let the story finally end the way it should, with everyone understanding exactly who built what remains standing." Alina had agreed, though she approached the preparations with far more purpose than mere celebration. The past year had brought genuine changes to Ashcombe Hall and its surrounding lands. The tenant farms, once neglected and struggling, now produced healthier harvests thanks to the irrigation improvements she had championed. The small school she had established for the tenants' children had grown from a modest single room into a proper building, staffed by 2 dedicated teachers and attended by nearly 30 eager students. The estate's finances, once teetering constantly on the edge of ruin, had stabilized and even begun to grow, careful investment replacing the reckless spending that had once threatened everything. Alastair, too, had continued along the path he had chosen following their separation. He remained at Thornfield, living a quieter life than he had once imagined for himself, but visiting the estate regularly to continue the education in proper management he had begun under Henry's patient guidance. He had, in the month since their formal separation, taken on genuine responsibility for overseeing several of the estate's smaller properties, managing them with a competence that surprised nearly everyone who had known him before, including, at times, himself. He had not remarried, nor had he pursued any serious relationship since the end of things with Seraphina. When asked about it occasionally by curious acquaintances, he offered only that he had spent so many years assuming his position, entitled him to whatever he wanted, that he preferred, for now, to focus on understanding what he had actually earned, rather than seeking new arrangements built on the same old carelessness. Serafina Cole, meanwhile, had built an entirely different life for herself in the year since the ball. She had used a portion of her family's savings, along with a small inheritance from an aunt, to establish a modest dress shop in a respectable part of London, catering to merchants' families much like her own who wanted fashionable clothing without the excessive prices demanded by shops serving only the aristocracy. The business had grown steadily, built on Serafina's genuine talent for fashion and her hard-won understanding that lasting security came from one's own efforts rather than borrowed promises. She occasionally received letters from a leaner, brief and businesslike, inquiring after the shop's progress or offering the occasional recommendation to acquaintances seeking quality dressmaking. Neither woman had ever become close friends, precisely, but a quiet mutual respect had developed between them, born from the strange circumstances that had once connected their lives so painfully. On the evening of the new ball, Elena stood once more at the top of the marble staircase overlooking her ballroom, though the scene before her felt entirely different from the chaos of a year earlier. The hall had been decorated with the same care and attention she brought to every aspect of the estate's management, elegant without excess, warm without pretension. Guests arrived in steady numbers, many of them familiar faces from the previous year's scandal, though their manner toward Elena now carried genuine warmth rather than mere curiosity about her sudden rise in fortune and reputation. Charlotte found her near the staircase, offering a glass of champagne with a knowing smile. Quite a different evening from the last one, would you not say? Considerably, Elena agreed, accepting the glass. Though I find myself grateful, in a strange way, for how that evening unfolded, I do not believe I would have found the courage to claim my place so fully otherwise. You always had the courage, Charlotte replied. You simply needed the right moment to use it. As the evening progressed, Elena moved comfortably among her guests, discussing estate improvements with interested lords, offering advice to young wives navigating their own difficult marriages, laughing genuinely at the wit of old friends who had once overlooked her entirely in favor of more exciting company. She had become, in the span of a single difficult year, exactly the kind of woman society had never expected her to be: confident, capable, and entirely secure in her own position. Near midnight, as the orchestra continued playing and guests moved gracefully across the ballroom floor, Alastair arrived, having been invited not as the master of the house he once assumed himself to be, but as a respected guest whose presence Elena had genuinely welcomed given his continued contributions to the estate's management. He found her near the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, the same spot where she had once stood calmly during his disastrous announcement a year before. "The hall looks beautiful," he said, approaching carefully. "You have done remarkable work with the estate this past year." "Thank you," Elena replied, genuine warmth in her voice, though no longer the wounded formality that had once colored their conversations. "The tenant harvests this season were the strongest they have been in over a decade. I believe your work with the eastern properties contributed a great deal to that success." Alastair accepted the compliment with visible surprise, unaccustomed still to genuine praise for effort rather than empty flattery for his title. "I am grateful for the opportunity to contribute something real, for once." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the guests move gracefully across the ballroom floor, the same room that had once witnessed the complete unraveling of everything Alastair believed about his own life and marriage. "I owe you an apology," Alastair said finally, "far larger than anything I offered in the months following our separation. I spent years assuming this house, this title, even you, belonged to me simply because of who I was born to be. I understand now how deeply mistaken that assumption was." "I appreciate you saying so," Elena replied, "though I believe your actions this past year have already spoken far louder than any words could." "Do you believe," Alastair asked carefully, "that people can genuinely change given enough time and enough reason to try?" Alina considered the question seriously, watching him with an expression that held neither lingering resentment nor false sentimentality, simply honest assessment born from a year of careful observation. "I believe," she said finally, "that some people can, provided they are willing to do the difficult, unglamorous work such change actually requires, rather than simply hoping their good intentions will be enough on their own. You have done that work this past year, Alistair, more consistently than I believed you capable of when we began this arrangement." It was, perhaps, as close to genuine reconciliation as their circumstances would ever allow, not a return to the marriage they had once shared, which had never truly served either of them well, but something quieter and more honest, a mutual respect built on demonstrated effort rather than empty promises. As the ball continued into the late hours of the evening, Alina eventually excused herself from the crowd, stepping out onto the small balcony overlooking the gardens where the events of that fateful night a year earlier had first taken root in her careful planning. She thought of everything that had changed since then, the tenant families now living in improved homes, the children attending the small school she had built, the estate's finances finally secure enough to plan confidently for the future rather than simply surviving it. She thought of Alistair, slowly rebuilding himself into someone worth genuine respect rather than mere inherited authority. She thought of Serafina, building her own independent success far from the borrowed promises that had once defined her ambitions. And she thought of herself, standing now exactly where she belonged, not because any man had granted her that position, but because she had built it herself, patiently and carefully, through years of quiet work that no one had bothered to notice until the moment she chose to make it undeniable. Charlotte joined her on the balcony after several minutes, carrying 2 fresh glasses of champagne. "A full year since that night," Charlotte said, handing Alina one of the glasses. "Does it feel as though it has been that long?" "In some ways," Alina said, "it feels as though an entire lifetime has passed since then. In others, it feels as though I am only now truly beginning." "Beginning what exactly?" Alina looked out over the gardens, moonlight settling gently across the ground she had fought so carefully to preserve, the hall behind her filled with music and laughter that belonged, finally and completely, to her. "Beginning the life I actually chose for myself," she said, "rather than the one I simply inherited by circumstance." Below them, the ball continued late into the night, guests dancing and laughing beneath the same golden chandeliers that had once witnessed a duke's careless announcement and a duchess's quiet, unshakable response. The story of that night had long since become something of a legend among London's social circles, retold often as a reminder that true power rarely announced itself loudly, and that the quietest person in the room was sometimes the one who held everything together. Alina Whitmore raised her glass gently toward the moonlit gardens, toward the estate she had built and rebuilt through patience and quiet determination, toward the future she had finally claimed entirely as her own. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt no need to wait for anyone's permission to feel proud of exactly who she had become. 5 years after the ball that changed everything, Ashcombe Hall had become known throughout the county not for scandal, but for something far more unusual among great estates of its kind, genuine prosperity, built on fairness rather than inherited privilege alone. Alina Whitmore, now simply referred to by most as the Duchess who had rebuilt an entire estate through her own determination, had expanded the small school she once founded into a proper academy, serving children from several surrounding villages. Young Grace Aldridge, one of the very first students to attend classes in that original single room, had grown into a bright young woman now training under the estate's physician, determined to bring proper medical care to families who had once gone without it entirely. The tenant farms, once barely surviving from season to season, now produced enough surplus that Alina had established a fair trading arrangement with neighboring estates, ensuring tenant families received proper compensation for their labor rather than the barest survival wages common elsewhere. Word of her methods had spread slowly among other landowners, some dismissing her approach as impractical sentiment, others quietly adopting similar practices after witnessing the genuine loyalty and productivity it inspired among the people who worked the land. Alastair had continued his gradual transformation as well, eventually taking on full responsibility for managing 3 of the estate's outer properties, a role he approached now with genuine care rather than the careless indifference that had once defined him. He remained unmarried, having politely declined several arrangements suggested by well-meaning relatives, explaining simply that he preferred, for now, to continue proving himself worthy of trust rather than seeking new obligations he might once again fail to honor properly. He and Alina maintained a respectful, occasionally warm friendship built entirely on the foundation of demonstrated change, rather than lingering romantic hope. They met regularly to discuss estate matters, occasionally shared a quiet dinner when practical business required extended conversation, and had, over the years, developed something neither had expected to find again: genuine mutual respect between 2 people who had once known each other only through disappointment. Seraphina Cole's dress shop had grown into one of the most respected establishments of its kind in London, known particularly for combining elegant design with prices accessible to families of modest means. She had, in the years since the scandal that once threatened to define her entirely, built a reputation entirely her own, separate from any man's promises or position. She had married eventually, a quiet, steady merchant named Edmund Hartwell who valued her intelligence and independence rather than feeling threatened by it, and the 2 had built a comfortable, honest life together, far different from the borrowed grandeur she had once believed she wanted. Occasionally, when business brought her into contact with Ashcombe Hall's affairs, she and Alina exchanged polite, businesslike correspondence, each recognizing in the other a woman who had ultimately built something real from the wreckage of a man's careless promises. Charlotte Bramwell remained Alina's closest confidant throughout these years, her sharp wit and unwavering loyalty a constant presence through every challenge the estate continued to present. It was Charlotte, more than anyone, who understood the full weight of everything Alina had built, having witnessed every difficult decision, every sleepless night spent reviewing accounts, every moment of doubt that preceded each eventual triumph. "Do you ever think of that night at all?" Charlotte asked one autumn afternoon, as the 2 women walked together through the estate's flourishing gardens, now tended by a staff of gardeners trained under Alina's careful supervision. "Occasionally," Alina admitted, "though it feels now like something that happened to an entirely different woman. I remember the fear more than anything, the uncertainty of whether I had done the right thing, whether the plan I had built so carefully would actually hold once tested in front of everyone who mattered." "It held," Charlotte said simply, "better than either of us could have hoped." Alina smiled, looking out over the fields where tenant families worked contentedly, their homes sturdy and well-maintained, their children educated and healthy, a stark contrast to the struggling estate she had fought so desperately to save all those years earlier. "I built something real," she said, "from what was nearly lost entirely to carelessness and pride. I do not know if I could have predicted, back then, exactly how far that foundation would eventually carry us." As the sun began to set over Ashcombe Hall that evening, casting warm golden light across the fields and gardens Alina had worked so tirelessly to restore, she reflected on the strange, difficult journey that had brought her to this particular moment of quiet contentment. She thought of the frightened young bride who had once accepted her husband's neglect without complaint, believing herself powerless to change the circumstances of her own life. She thought of the patient woman who had spent years learning to read ledgers and understand contracts, quietly building protection for a family too careless to protect itself. She thought of the composed Duchess who had stood calmly in her own ballroom, refusing to let humiliation define her when the moment finally arrived to claim what she had rightfully built. And she thought, finally, of the woman she had become since, confident, capable, respected not because of any title bestowed upon her by marriage, but because of everything she had built with her own patient determination. The estate that had once nearly collapsed under the weight of one man's carelessness now stood as a testament to what genuine effort, patience, and quiet strength could accomplish, even against circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. Ashcombe Hall belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, not simply on paper, but in every meaningful sense that truly mattered. And as the golden light faded gently into evening, settling peacefully over the land she had fought so carefully to save, she felt, at last, entirely and completely at peace with everything she had built. The story that had once begun with a careless announcement in a crowded ballroom had ended, finally, exactly as it should have, not with revenge or bitterness, but with the quiet, unshakable triumph of someone who had simply refused to be underestimated any longer. And for Eleanor, that triumph had always been worth far more than any title a careless man could have ever promised her.